You are listening to ProveText, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to ProveText. I'm Michael Halcomb, and today I am here with Dr. Philip Tallon. Dr. Tallon is Associate Professor of Theology. Update me if I'm wrong on any of this. And Dean of the School of Christian. Good so far. And Dean of the School of Christian Thought at Houston Christian University. And I've been impressed over the years watching Houston Christian University sort of just blossom and develop and grow. It's been pretty neat to watch that sort of from a distance. But do students call you Dr. Phil? Do they just mess with you and they say that, or do you not get that?
No, I don't think the students watch a lot of Southern Fried daytime TV advice shows, but sometimes grown-ups will call me Dr. Phil. I'm fine with that. And typically it's amongst the more formal students, our homeschool students, respectful Dr. Tallon, and sometimes that devolves into just Tallon.
Oh, interesting. All right. Yeah. Well, so you're the Dean of the School of Christian Thought. What does that mean, mm-hmm. School of Christian Thought, for people who may not be familiar with that? Professor of Theology, Dean of School of Christian Thought. What's Christian Thought?
Maybe that's just a way of saying theology, which is what we're about here. We, of course, we do biblical studies. We do historical studies, linguistics. So we have our classics and biblical languages. So studying the Greco-Roman world as a context for understanding the Bible better and languages. But we're more than just religious studies folks. We don't study the phenomenon of Christian religion. We talk about God, right? Because God has revealed himself. And so then we can, in turn, use that revelation to think and speak faithfully about who God is. And we also have apologetics as well. So I think the thought part was trying to capture a little bit more of the philosophical dimension, so Christian thought. But what we are is we're a college that has undergraduate, graduate, now postgraduate studies. So we train people for ministry and for the academy who are want to do theological studies of some kind. So we've got a bunch of undergraduates that are here, and then the majority of our students are part of Houston Theological Seminary, which is an element of the college, and we've got over 200 students who are doing Masters of Divinity or Christian leadership or apologetics or other kinds of biblical studies degrees, and who are headed all sorts of directions. We just launched a Doctor of Ministry, and so we have our second class now. And so those are not people who are headed in ministry; those are working ministers who are coming back and leveling up, freshening up some of their seminary training and then refining how to do really top-notch academic work for the sake of the church. And we've got a New Testament track because we have big biblical studies focus here in our department of theology. And we also have a faith and culture track. So kind of understanding the world of human expression and cultural apologetics and what's going on today. And we kind of combine those so that people are doing their DMin, they've kind of got the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other that shapes their ministry project.
My sort of introduction, I believe, to some of your work was the initial project. I think it was your initial project you did with Seedbed. Yeah, the absolute basics of the Christian faith. That we call it a quick sketch of beliefs, but it was like there you go. Yes, a great. Let's talk about that for a minute, if you don't mind. So, what was the impetus for that project? Like, where was that born out of? Where did that come from?
Well, I think it came from two things. One is, of course, I studied theology at Asbury and then at the University of St. Andrews, and love Christian doctrine and trying to just, really refine our theological language and do it in a way that's faithful to the tradition of the church and to Scripture. And so I've been teaching the core classes in Christian doctrine for some number of years, and I was working full time at a church and was the director of student ministries there. This is after my PhD, and was looking at our confirmation process. Oh man, it was really a series of kind of wonderful presentations that were not organized in any particular way. And so what kind of curriculum is out there? So I started to look around for good curriculum, and if I had found it, I think that would have been it. But I couldn't find something that I thought delivered that basic deposit of Christian doctrine for young people in a way that was clear and was kind of rigorous, but then also was as accessible as it could possibly be. And I have a high view of the understanding that a 12-year-old can have, which is to say that they're doing algebra and studying all kinds of other things. They can understand Christian doctrine as well. And so I just, okay, well, I'm going to put this together myself. So I had a team of advisors and people that I talked to, but put together a list of the core things. And it's basically the Nicene Creed, moving from the doctrine of God through, creation, the story of fall and covenant and redemption, and then, getting it theology of Jesus Christ, the person and work of Christ, so salvation, and then on to age of the church, the work of the Spirit, eschatology. And what I did was then at every point where we laid out like a doctrinal bit, I would then try and couch that in a big explanatory metaphor or image that could act as a sort of a nest in which that idea could come to rest. And so we produced that. We made these kind of sketch style videos, and that was all just while I was working there. And then Seedbed came up and said, oh, we're interested in this. And so we redid the videos and edited the book, added more material actually as footnotes at the end, and they published it. And I think that's been, of all I wrote a book from Oxford, and I've done some other academic work, but by far the most impactful thing that I've done has been this. And I hear all the time from folks who are, man, in church this is just so helpful. Our students really resonate with it, and so I'm pleased that God put me in that spot where I saw that and was able to use some of my training to create a resource. And we followed up. We made one about Wesleyan sort of history and characteristics as well, and have put that. Actually, they're asking me for more. I'm kind of looking for a Bible scholar who wants to come work with me on absolute basics of the Bible.
Let's talk.
And maybe we'll, let's talk and put something out there that will help to walk people through the big story of Scripture and understand those kind of like key pieces they need in order to organize their understanding of the story of God's redemption.
So I mean that takes some skill to be able to create resources that work for teenagers, or 12-year-old preteens. Yet then to be able to sort of switch gears and write for Oxford. I mean, I look at some of your publications, The Argument from Beauty and Play, The Poetics of Evil. I do want to talk about evil a little bit, because seems quite a bit of your thinking, your Christian thought has orbited around this idea of evil. You have In Defense of the Problem of Pain, an essay there. Evil and the Cosmic Dance. Tolkien's Pretty Fair Nonsense, Tolkien's View of the Arts. And then you're working on horror as well, Through a Mirror Darkly, art horror as a locus for moral reflection. Psycho, horror, Hitchcock, and the Problem of Evil. So, man, let's talk like I said, that takes some skill to be able to shift from those absolute basic sketches and videos and writing at the level for teenagers to shift to this kind of thing. I think where you're writing at quite a bit, probably a higher level. So, what got you into, or what hooked you on this idea of like horror and evil, and this kind of thing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, and I do shift modes. I will say writing for popular audience is harder than writing academic work in terms of the composition at the very least and the amount of editing involved.
Yeah.
But I think so I settled on the problem of evil partly because I'm interested in apologetics and in theology that's informed by philosophical rigor. I really appreciate the analytic tradition and how it attempts to really bring as much clarity as possible to terms that are being used and find definitions and then to make clear the kind of elements of an argument. And so that's kind of one half of my brain, as it were. And then the other half, though, I mean, I just have always been just entranced by creative expression in the arts as just a powerful force in my life. I think almost everybody is. I mean, I think almost everybody is shaped by this stuff. But I love thinking about it and want to work on it. Wish that I could be an artist, who produced those sorts of things. And so when I started to work on my dissertation, and I was working on theology in the arts. So I was at the University of St. Andrews, where they have a special focus there. So people like Jeremy Begbie and Trevor Hart. Trevor Hart was my doctoral supervisor, were there, and they're some of the leading people. And just looking at what's going on, a lot of the focus in discussing theology in the arts was looking at the arts as a kind of a reflection of God's beauty or elements of transcendence, or it was largely conducted, as it were, in a positive register, in a major key, maybe you might say.
I see.
And so it struck me that, well, of course, an understanding of evil is a part of Christian theology, and we have a theology of evil. And so what is there to say about the relationship between, say, the problem of evil and the arts? And as I began to read into this, I found that there was a lot of opposition in the sort of contemporary philosophical world. And that's where a lot of the discussion happens, because it's sort of a discussion to some degree in problem of evil between philosophers, people who are not theologians, as it were, because they disbelieve in God, who are articulating problems of evil, and then theologians who are, or philosophers who are trying to respond. So you have to be kind of involved in the philosophical discussion there. And so I brought in some of that, but there's all this opposition to using the arts or beauty or aesthetics as like a distraction. It's like you're distracted by these other things, and really this is a moral question. It's not an aesthetic question. But if you go back and you read somebody like St. Augustine, or if you read Anselm, or many other people, they really don't separate out those transcendentals or those spheres of concern. It's all different ingredients in one big pot, that are sort of in a stew. And so I looked at Augustine as a kind of an example of an integrated response to the problem of evil. So Augustine would often use artistic metaphors or aesthetic kind of values when he's talking about the problem of evil. And I didn't think that all of his approaches worked, but I wanted to say, well, actually, I think maybe there's something about this way of doing things. Like if God is a unity of the true, the good, and the beautiful, and everything God makes has that kind of integration, at some level, then we should think about that. So I looked at some of the ways that you might call metaphors, but they're a little bigger than metaphors. They're almost like models, these like artistic models for talking about evil. So there are categories we have, like tragedy, right, which is both an artistic category, right? It's a kind of play or a sort of story that you might tell. It's a genre, but then it also is a way that we refer to evils that occur. Oh, that was a tragedy, you know. And so the question was, well, what sort of work is that comparison doing when we evoke as sort of a genre to speak about a kind of evil? What's the interaction there between the sort of the real world evil that's occurring and the artistic associations that come along with it? And so what I tried to do was to interrogate the metaphors and the artistic elements as seriously as we interrogate the propositions in a logical argument.
Yeah.
You know, okay, let's really look at kind of all the things that go into that. And what you find is that by bringing these artistic categories in some ways it makes the problem of evil sharper. When you think about horror as a category, you know, it actually gives more weight to to an evil.
Makes sense.
But it also opens up connections to Christian theology that offer resources. And so when we think about this is the Easter season, and so we think about Good Friday.
Mm-hmm.
There are horrific elements. So if you use this lens of horror, there are horrific elements within the passion that come to light, and then that opens up some resources for those who suffer horrors of identification, right, with a God who also has gone all the way down to the worst way that we could describe evil, and we find God is there. And so that integrated approach, I think, then offers a more detailed map of reality, right, that has some texture to it. And it also offers some kind of directions and ways that we can move in theology that, you know, help to point us back toward God. So there's a turn. It doesn't just make things worse. It turns us and directs us back toward a satisfying response to the problem of evil.
Interesting. So you have we were just chatting a bit ago, but you have a project on horror that sort of that may be coming down the pipeline. Say a bit about that. Yeah,
I've got a contract on a book. I've got a wonderful co-writer named Cameron McAllister, who's a cultural apologist, and it's to some degree just an amplification of the work that I did in that essay that you mentioned before about art horror, which is that we think that, so we look at horror films primarily as kind of as an instance, a campfire we can gather around and sort of do some theological reflection. And one of there's a lot of suspicion around horror as a category, or at least as a section in the video store, a section on Netflix, especially in Christian circles. You know, it's like, maybe this is exploitation, sometimes it is, or it's maybe this will defile you in some way. And I think that actually it can, so it doesn't necessarily need to do that. But it also has so there's bad horror, just like there's bad, you know, TV shows or bad Disney movies, right? There's horror that's unhelpful for reflection or consumption. But there's an interesting feature about horror as a genre, which is that it is kind of helpfully impolite in a way that I think can be valuable, which is to say that most popular entertainment, especially Hollywood popular entertainment, has a kind of an underlying positivity throughout, you know, which is that it has to find resolution, and that's changing a little bit now. I think we've got a lot more of these kind of stories of people with really mixed characters and anti-heroes and so forth, and you know, and more nihilistic entertainment. But horror is typically kind of, you might think of it as the person at the party who's not afraid to just say exactly what's on their mind, even if it makes everybody uncomfortable. And I think that's so valuable if you're interacting with works of art and artists as people with something to say, to hear from voices that you wouldn't normally get to hear from. But there's also a philosophical and a theological value, which is that horror provokes reactions in us. I think because it's evoking some kind of fundamental incongruity or disorder that we think should be there, right? So kind of it's disrupting social order or the moral order or the natural order. Very often there's a
Wow,
monster that is not
that's
operating
interesting.
by
Yeah.
normal rules, or there's a deranged person who's got a sort of a really deformed character that's driving them these strange ways. And so what horror often opens up is because it causes these reactions of fear and revulsion are sort of two of the key emotional reactions. Because it does that, you can then use it to reflect, okay, well, why is that the case? Sort of, why is this disturbing me? And so in a sense, by looking at the thing that's being negated, you can see a little bit more clearly the underlying fundamental good order that we assume should be present. And so so horror, kind of by smashing something that maybe we'd forgotten was even there, when you kind of put the pieces back together, you see the thing again. And so it's I think it's a particularly philosophical genre of art,
Mm,
because in order to be effective, you have to find a way to identify a kind of a feature of life that maybe we just assumed or forgotten about, and then sort of puncture it, you know. And then
interesting.
there's also things that I think horror movies can just address, that where it doesn't have to, they don't have to resolve, you know, it doesn't have to propose a solution. It can just kind of poke us in a way, and then unsettle us, and then that can be useful as a part of a well-balanced diet, I should say. Sometimes when people hear me talk about this, they say, "Oh, so you're saying I have to watch horror movies, but it'll lose sleep?" I say, no, no, no. I'm not saying that. Or people are saying, "So you're saying I should only, watch horror movies?" I think that would be a bad idea. Or you should watch all horror movies? No.
Bad
Um,
idea.
and so I think in Christian circles, sometimes we take, so by saying something that is permissible, or even something might be beneficial, as saying that everyone should be
Right.
able to do this. And I don't think that's the case with a lot of things in life.
Yeah.
And so people should use their conscience as a
Sure.
guide.
Well, you on your list of courses taught, you've also got a class called uh, comedy in the Western tradition.
Mhm.
So, all right, most people would think, all right, horror, very, very different, maybe diametrically opposed to comedy. But the way I hear you talk about horror, this idea of incongruity, and I'm actually working on stand up comedy. That's like a kind of a low key obsession of mine, and I've just started getting into it and did my first showcase a few weeks ago, and have another one coming up in a few weeks. So
All
stand up
right.
comedy, but the whole thing with comedy, I mean, not the whole thing, but a large chunk of comedy is that same thing, incongruity,
Hmm.
right? I don't know, you set up a premise, right, and then you're going to misdirect, which creates some sort of incongruity, and then you deliver the punch, and then the person real quickly in their mind, right, is kind of like fitting it all together somehow, but it's that incongruity that makes it
Hmm.
work. So I'm I'm curious just to hear you maybe talk about can you draw a line from horror to comedy? Is that the
Hmm.
line, or are there multiple lines? Yeah, so I'm
Hmm.
curious about.
There are actually, they're very connected, and they both trade on incongruity. One is a sort of threatening incongruity, and the other is a non-threatening, or benevolent
Right.
incongruity. I think
Yeah.
is the similarity there.
Yeah.
And so Northrop Frye has this kind of cycle of seasons proposal, where you have spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and autumn is tragedy, and spring is comedy, winter is satire, and there's a horror, I think, operates kind of at the twilight between tragedy and satire, which is it sort of like pushing so dark that sometimes it tips over into being funny, right? So where you
Right.
sort of, if you lose the emotional identification with the person, then it just becomes amusing, or some such thing as that. The So I think somebody said, yeah, the tragedy is when someone falls and breaks their pinky. Comedy is when someone falls and breaks their neck. It's like you push over the line in some sense. So you cease to identify with the person. That's so bad. It could happen to me. I can understand falling and breaking the pinky, but breaking your neck, that's so extreme. But there's real philosophical work on this. And so there's a philosopher named Noel Carroll who actually writes about comedy and horror. And he described his theory of comedy, which I think is pretty close to being right, or as right as I can figure, is that comedy is when you have the emotion that it produces is comic amusement, and that emotion is in response to some kind of uh, benevolent incongruity that doesn't provoke a problem-solving attitude or something like that. And
Yeah.
so it's when somebody answers a question in a way that makes sense of the literal form of the question, but is exactly the opposite of what you might expect. I mean, that's the
Right.
punchline often has to be both kind of generated by what the setup is, but then be opposite of what you'd
Yes. Right.
expect to be the case. So a guy is calls up his friend and he says, "Hey, watch out! I know you're driving. I just saw on the news there's a maniac driving the wrong way down the highway." And his friend says, "Yeah, one maniac? Are you kidding? There are hundreds of them."
Right.
And so the friend has understood what his other friend is warning him about, but he's completely misunderstood, because he is in fact the maniac driving the wrong
Right.
way. And so there's no real threat there. This is an amusing setup. It would not be amusing to actually be the person who's driving the wrong way on the
Right.
highway.
Exactly.
That would be more like an action movie, or maybe it would turn horrific if it were real, or
There's
you're the
an
person on the passenger
incongruity
seat.
there, right? Like that's what makes
Yeah.
it work. The incongruity is you don't expect that in real life for hundreds of people to be driving the wrong way down the highway, right? Like, so the incongruity is what makes that work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that someone would believe that they're still on the right side of the highway, even if everyone else is driving toward them. And so those are related. And comedy is also akin to horror, in that you might almost see it as it has many of the elements of horror, but it takes place in a more benevolent universe, or a more benevolent take on life. And so in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, like, all this terrible stuff befalls the main character, that she's shipwrecked, she's lost her brother, she thinks her brother is drowned in this storm, and so then she sets out to make a new life in this town, and there's all sorts of charming confusions, romantic mix-ups, but then it turns out in the end that her brother is part of the mix-up is that her brother's in town, and that people are confusing them for each other, because the main character is dressing up as a boy in this case. And she observes at the end, when she learns her brother is alive, she says, "Oh, tempests are kind," right? And comedy often takes place in a world where tempests are kind. The kind of the difficulties of life don't devolve into tragedy or into true misfortune, but we still hit the ground, but we're made of rubber, and so we bounce back. And there's a kind of a benevolence there, and certainly there are aspects of comic life that are beyond misfortune. So people like G.K. Chesterton talk about the kind of great comedy of being a human is that we have these minds and this deep calling and these and souls and a vast thing, but we live in these bodies, right, that are fallible, and we fall,
Right.
and there's all kinds of just normal human things that where we're kind of interrupted by our bodily life. And so there's an incongruity in our very person, right? And so you could see that incongruity as threatening and horrific, I suppose, or you could see it as part of the comic reality of living life in God's world.
Yeah.
So,
I was just, I try to write jokes every day. Most of them just fall flat, but that's become almost like, I don't know, a daily therapeutic thing for me. Even just, it's fun to do that. I wrote a joke the other day. I said, yesterday, some lady made fun of me for being short, but honestly, I'm okay with it because now I'm making fun of her for being dead.
Whoa.
Right. So, like, it's an interesting joke in the conversation. Obviously, it's not true, right? But it's perfect, I think, for what we're talking about because it goes dark. You're not
Mm-hmm.
expecting it. Somebody slights you just for being short, and then boom, there's this massive incongruity, and it goes dark, almost into horror, right? Like, and if you watch a guy like Anthony Jeselnik, I don't know if you ever heard of him, but his comedy has gone very dark over the years, and his whole thing is almost like trading on the notion of horror, like almost all of his jokes, and he goes into these deep into these like pretty kind of taboo social subjects: abortion, sexuality, religion. He doesn't do politics, but so it's interesting. Somebody like that, who has actually made a sort of name off of finding the intersection of horror and comedy, I would say.
Yeah, it's that's where his work exists in kind of in more in that sort of like that winter space of sort of deadened emotional realities and identification. His persona is basically the devil, right?
Right.
And
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
the framing that then we then filter his jokes through. So I remember seeing a tweet of his some years back, which was, "I don't think I'm ready to get a house plant. I can't even keep a baby alive." Um, and it's awful, right? I mean, that's it's awful, and it only works if you've already kind of understood. Well, first of all, you understand the reversal there,
Yeah.
the sort of
Yep.
typical order. We got a house plant, so then we can learn how to take care of something before we have a kid or a puppy, and
Yep.
then, but it only works if you're basically able to critically distance yourself such that you don't sort of imagine or entertain, the reality that you're referring to, or
Right.
don't take it seriously at all. Like, he's joking. And there are other comics who, and of course, I mean, all this stuff is a big scale. I mean, there are other comics who then are able to sort of integrate more of their personas. They're actually trading on kind of their real life stories, and there's more of a merger there between what's going on. But but Jeselnik is definitely in that black humor
Yeah.
kind of vein that requires a kind of an intentional bracketing of normal human values in order to find it amusing.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Yeah, just I don't know, finding like hearing the work you're doing, sort of the intersections between comedy and horror. And as I look at your courses taught, I mean, it's impressive too to see you pretty much are teaching across history, right? You're doing the ancient Greek world, the ancient Roman and early Christian worlds, medieval and Renaissance worlds, Enlightenment and modernity, the last 100 years. Tell us a little bit about your course on the last 100 years. What's that covering?
Oh, that's so. For years here, I was the chair of apologetics, and I also taught in our honors college. And our honors college is a great books program where we go from
Okay.
we take students, instead of doing the kind of separated cafeteria style mode of, okay, I'm going to take a philosophy course and a history course, an English course, and a theology course. We do basically a chronological work through of great books, starting in ancient Greece and then moving up into about the 1950s. And then we also read scripture along with that, and then we conclude with a big survey of scripture, reading through most of the Bible, but not all. And so I was delighted to teach in the honors program. We would, so you teach books, it's a Socratic style. We sit down, we open up a book, and it was wonderful because we were actually teaching a bunch of different, things at different times, not moving through kind of one particular class. And so, one week it would be Jane Austen, the next week it would be Dante, and then be off, reading Karl Barth with students and that kind of thing, scripture. And it really did help to provide that kind of the overview. I mean, so most of those texts I was familiar with or read or, had at least read about. And we're actually just interacting with the real thing, as the primary source, of course, mostly in translation until you get up to the English text. But we're, sort of studying that, and you just get a feel for the change that happens in history and the different questions. And then also what questions remain the same, what are we as humans? What is a good life?
Right.
How do we relate to ultimate concerns? The problem of evil, how this world, we live in this world which is full of injustice and suffering, and how do we understand that and fight it, and so it was a beautiful thing. And I've gotten to teach some of those kind of integrative classes. I taught that comedy class as a sort of review. We looked at some of the philosophy and theology of comedy, and then we read through, the history of comedic texts, some ancient Greek, and then it kind of kicks off in the Middle Ages is when you start to get Christian comedic works, and then it blossoms, and especially throughout Shakespeare and so forth, and it was kind of it was a pleasure. It was sort of like getting paid to make up for my laziness as an undergrad and high school student when I did, often didn't read well those texts. And now I got to have a redemptive second chance to go back and actually dig in and really immerse myself in great books.
Yeah, I wish I had paid more attention in my undergrad and my high school for sure. The English classes were often my favorite, but I could have done better in those classes without a doubt. So let's talk about apologetics for a minute, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Okay. You have apologetics on the one hand, and you're familiar with polemics on the other, right? Yeah. So the idea, apologetics being that we're sort of on the defense, we're defending Christianity. Polemics, no, we need to go on the offensive, and put the others on the defense. So, why has Christianity tended to work in sort of the realm of apologetics rather than polemics? Why would we tend to wait for the argument to come to us and we defend rather than, go on the offensive?
Yeah, that's okay. That's an interesting question. That's not one that I think I've ever been asked before, and so kudos to
on the spot a little
you
bit
there. No, I get what you're saying, and let me entertain the idea. So I think that when I think about more kind of classical Christian works of what you might call apologetics, it's often responding to accusations against Christians, or something. People are saying this, and so we need to respond. And I think that I would say, to some degree, Christian proclamation, is that constructive, positive voice that's always taken place within the church of just like, we proceed in with this faith that is informed, it's a faith-seeking understanding, and we proclaim the word, and we proceed from there, often within the context of the life of the church. But we understand that there are people outside that have these questions, and so we want to help them out, as those questions come up. Apologetics tends to be very reactive. I don't think it's always defensive, even though that's the Greek term, as you, Greek master, know. But it's reactive in that the questions change, like depending on every age, and different
Right.
people have different questions. And so it's sort of this, 1 Peter 3:15 kind of thing. Okay, helping people to understand the hope that you have, and that's going to depend on the kinds of folks that you're interacting with in each and every age. I suppose there's there's been a lot of polemics within Christian work, very often intra-Christian polemics, right? I mean, sort of, so you,
Yes.
and I'm not opposed to that. I think that there's a certain sense in which when you love something fiercely and you want people to understand it the same way, you do express your opinions strongly, and sometimes Christian polemic has been infected with ad hominem, but
Yeah.
but I think we also just live in an age that's kind of overly concerned with politeness and people's feelings in a way that I think you just don't find as much in other ages. And so what seems to us maybe just like, whoa, this is too much, is a little bit more just kind of the standard way of doing things. And so, but I think in some ways, Michael, that the orientation of Christian proclamation, moving from a place of faith and acceptance of Christian truth does change the trajectory of Christian discourse, right? Which is to say that the terms on which we speak and conduct our lives aren't dictated by those we disagree with. They're dictated by the form of God's self-revelation and the charge that we're given. And so the church has its own kind of integrity and culture within which we speak from this place of faith. And so as opposed to politics, right, which in many ways is almost by nature is going to be defined by this, disagreement and discourse or haggling and so forth, there's a kind of freedom that I think Christian theology has to just reflect back on God that shapes the nature of our discourse. But of course, we encounter people who disagree with us or attacking us, and you've got to step up. And so if I grant that there's this kind of, that maybe apologetics more than polemics has kind of dictated how we do things, then I might say something like that. There is, of course, part of apologetics is you might call like offensive or constructive apologetics, where you go out and you say, okay, well, here are the arguments for God's existence. What are you gonna do with that? Like, which of these,
Right.
which of the premises do you disagree with? And that is, I don't think that's polemical, but it's it is going on the attack, as it were, and trying to put your opponent, into a defensive position. Okay, you got to do something with this argument. And so that has always been, part of the Christian tradition of these kind of positive arguments for God's existence. Anselm's not, and he's formulating the ontological argument. He's not thinking about how do I show these unbelievers that God exists. He's thinking about other stuff. But but arguments for God's existence go back a long ways, or other kinds of positive arguments. And certainly now, I think, you find different approaches. Somebody like Mike Licona, is offering positive arguments for the historicity of the resurrection.
Yeah.
Okay, here's evidence. Here's what I think is a likely conclusion. Okay, where's the problem? That's, you might call an offensive version of apologetics.
Do we need apologetics? And I'm asking that in the sense of, obviously you're an apologist, so you're probably going to say yes. But I'm asking this in the sense of, I've long thought about the idea that, little old me, like, God doesn't need me to defend him. So maybe you've heard an argument like this, that God's a big boy. He can defend himself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He doesn't need me to do it. So, I don't know. So give me some sort of response to that mentality. Somebody who might say, apologetics is futile, it's useless. God doesn't need our defense of him. He can defend himself.
Well, God can do anything, yet he seems to want to use humans as a part of his redemptive plan. In fact, is worryingly committed to it in ways that I sometimes wish that he weren't. And so he seems to have charged us with this great task. And so, God can do all and could do everything, but I think that there's still important work that he's tasked us with. And of course, I think Scripture gives positive examples of people engaging in what you might call apologetic arguments. Paul on Mars Hill is a famous example. The First Peter quote that I just gave. Paul's having to. The same thing you might say is like, well, God can sort out this Jew-Gentile divide, in the early church on his own. He doesn't need me to do this. But yet it seemed quite important that Paul weigh in. And so I think that, I think that the work of doing theology and then doing public theology is something that God has tasked us with, to proclaim the good news. And when there are defeaters out there for the good news, you got to go after them. And so somebody like Tim Keller, I think, is a really fine example of someone whose primary mission was just to proclaim the word of God, but he understood that his audience had these objections. I thought miracles couldn't happen, or but the Trinity's incoherent, right? Like it doesn't really make sense. And so he's got to, in order to effectively proclaim the word, he's got to then move away these obstacles to belief, to kind of make that straight path. And so I think that that's a part of our work, and it's not everybody's job to do everything,
right?
That needs to be done in the world. We all have different divisions of labor, and sometimes God makes people with especially sort of tough minds and stubborn dispositions that he specially charges to go into the heart of theological debate. Martin Luther was an intense dude, but God can use those kind of folks for a good purpose. But I think all of us, even much more conflict avoidant and sweeter people like me, can help in that regard, because I found it useful when somebody's kind of got a question, if they sort of test you on it. If you have a good response, then you take that person a little more seriously. Oh, okay, like this actually, and there's more to it than maybe I thought. And so I like it for when people want to sort of test that, they find that there's more there. And that helps their faith. That helps to encourage their faith, even if they're not going to look into all that stuff. They this is right. But there's so much error and ignorance and apathy out there in the world that I think we should carry on showing how the Christian faith is true and good and beautiful. And that's maybe in my opinion, I think a lot of the objections that people have to apologetics are that it's only being kind of conducted in this one mode, which is to say, it's only being conducted in sort of argumentative debate, which most people aren't suited for. But there are other ways that you help show that the Christian faith is true and good and beautiful, and showing actually no, there's here is a work of art, that really brings home some value. Or here's you have this question about Scripture. Let me show you, actually, if you understand just a little bit more about the background context, you can understand this verse. It's comprehensible. Oh, I didn't even see that there before. Or feeling the beauty of the Christian life, a life, giving a life of, pouring yourself out for others, right? And so the life of a saint, being something that you then see and feel. And to me, that's apologetics too, right? Because that's
Yeah.
helping people to then kind of interact with this beautiful unity that is there at the heart of the gospel.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. So it's interesting. I was just doing, I'm circling back to comedy for a minute. I was in this context. I was taking a comedy class, it's an online class,
Hmm.
and the individual teaching the class referred to themselves as a hardcore atheist. And so I think it was class session number 2, got opened. He opened up, and it was like a 20-30 minute rant just on the futility and silliness of Christianity, religion in general, but Christianity in particular. And so I'm sitting there listening, and I'm hearing this individual take verses out of context to make his point, and um, I'm thinking, man, I could like defeat this guy's arguments like in my sleep, like it's that easy, like, and so it was that there was a point there, like during that session, I decided if I'm gonna do this comedy thing, I'm gonna I'm gonna I'm gonna say something substantive, theologically substantive with my comedy. And so the joke I wrote earlier obviously wasn't anything theologically substantive, but stupid stuff like that'll come to mind while I'm sitting down writing. But I started writing these whole sets of actually like trying to defend the existence of God, or I got a whole set about Christians aren't responsible for the most deaths and wars and that sorts of thing. Actually, atheism, right? I have a whole set built around that. And so I started delivering these sets because at the end of each session, we'd have a time where we'd do that. And several weeks later, after I've done that, I could see the entire disposition of this guy changing. And by the end of all that, by the end of the class, he had come to a point where he had stopped actually referring to himself as an atheist, and maybe I'm an agnostic, maybe. And it was interesting to watch how humor just busted down those walls. And I was thinking, well, this is apologetics. I'm doing apologetics here, maybe a little bit of polemics too. Because in this case, like, he had put me on the defensive initially, but then I decided I'm going to start every week a new set on this different aspect of religion. And so maybe a little bit of polemics as well. But then, not even just referring him to himself as an agnostic by the end of it, but he had warmed up. So warmed up to me. He had so warmed up to the faith again. He had grown up in, I think, the Catholic Church or something. But that was interesting to watch that shift happen. I think it's George Carlin says something like, get them laughing so that when they open their mouth to laugh, you feed them something substantive. He says something to that effect. And
some would observe that comedy is like a rubber sword. It makes a point without drawing blood. It's a powerful vehicle for adjusting people's attitudes and sort of shifting the window of what's acceptable, good or bad. It works both ways, and so you're kind of, I mean, I like that's cultural apologetics, which is you're interacting kind of within the same sphere. And humans are so social as well. I think we're part angel and part lemming, right? In that we're so bound up in our social context that when you break out of your bubble of I don't know, like whoever the podcasts and comedians that you're listening to, maybe who only ever exclusively agree with you, and then suddenly you're interacting with people in your community who are very different. fifth year mentality. Okay, like
Yeah.
this, there's something there. Maybe I don't agree with it, but I kind of know I understand a little bit more about the people that I'm speaking to, my audiences, even.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Pretty fascinating stuff just to watch that happen. So I wasn't thinking at the time I'm doing apologetics, but the whole cultural apologetics, I think that's a really fair and accurate description of what's going on there. And it's interesting as if I were to take the same kind of set and drop it into like a church context, it would no longer, I don't know, maybe it would be a cultural apologetics still, but it wouldn't have that. I guess it is still defending in a way, even if you're shifting the audience. So I haven't really thought a lot about that. I just know, like, I want to say something substantive theologically, something good, true, beautiful, to leave people thinking about. And so I don't know. It's a tough job to do that and stay clean and
Of course, a lot of the apologetic activity that goes on is really just giving Christians confidence, because we're all a little bit atheists inside now. We live in the modern world, right? So we're all aware of atheism. Everybody's, even if you say they have the same theological views as your great grandparents, they're different in certain ways. They're sort of there's maybe a lower probability, or there's some other kind of doubt that's haunting that's also there, and so it's helpful for probably within for Christians to hear humorous and charming kind of articulations of big ideas in a way that then can kind of play in the more informal discourse. Sitting at the bar, people are joking around, and instead of shifting modes, okay, now let's talk about something serious and philosophical. And if you can still deploy truth in a way that has a light touch and an amusing quality, then you're kind of engaging in that discourse in a helpful way. So giving people some jokes. Yeah, you can't put the joke about the lady being dead into your set. Now she was laughing being short. Now I'm laughing at her because her car is covered with tracks.
Yeah. So I mean, if you ever have seen, Bart Ehrman, sort of just speak or debate live, he's a master at this. Really, I mean, he does a wonderful job of disarming an entire audience of Bible scholars and theologians and lay Christians with humor. He's really, really good at that. And I saw him and one of your colleagues debate at an SBL years back, and your colleague certainly had the more substantive data. Yet it could have been, the room could have been read as though Ehrman won the debate because he was maybe more charming and winsome, and so
you can win the debate and not win the audience in a lot of ways. And no, Ehrman is a masterful communicator and a very gifted popularizer, and so and there's a sense in which, of course, the having the more skeptical position is kind of an easier position to hold, right? Which is that the Christians committed to so many things, right? That and very often in particular traditioned ways that kind of constrain, the sort of moves you can make. Where Ehrman has a sort of freedom, then you might say, so, okay, well, I agree with this, like, good argument for the historicity of Jesus. Here's all this good evidence, but like these other things I disagree with, and so he's probably got a little bit of an easier time of it. The Christian debater has two opponents. One, on the one side, you've got your skeptical antagonist, and then also you've got a bunch of other Christians waiting there with shanks in their socks, and they're gonna shank you to death if you sort of concede on the wrong thing. And so it's a difficult task to undertake.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Phil, it's been great chatting with you. Before we go here, where can people find you? And then we'll get a parting shot. Like, where you on social media? Can people link up with you, follow you?
I
Or?
am, yeah. I'm on all the networks. I don't have any of them on my phone at present, but if you follow me, you can see old stuff, and I'll occasionally post. So I'm on. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Old Hundredth. That's like the psalm tune name, and you can find me on Facebook, Phil Tallon,
Great.
and so very Googleable. But people should really go follow Houston Theo Sam and our school social media, because those are much more active, and that'll tell you I'm more likely to appear on those channels than I am on
Okay.
my own.
All right. Well, we ask everybody to leave us with a parting shot, if they would, a quote, an idea, a thought, something for us additional to just chew on. So, you got anything to throw our way?
Yeah. So, well, this kind of connects to our argument. So, our discussion earlier about about how to kind of get the truth across, and so there's a great poem by Emily Dickinson that I think gets at, in certain ways, the art of communicating truth, especially in a kind of contested time. And so here's my poem as a methodology, or maybe an inspiring poem for the comedian that's trying to get things across, which is, it goes like this: tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. And then it goes on a bit, and the final line is one that I really like. She says, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And I think that's a good word for us, is that we want to keep telling the truth, but sometimes you have to tell it slant, through the arts, or through comedy, or through some other kind of winsome expression.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Phil, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for watching and listening. Check out glossahouse.com. Check out youtube.com @glossahouse. All kinds of free stuff there. Great resources. Phil, I appreciate you, brother. It's great talking to you, and keep up the great work. And yeah, we'll talk again soon, hopefully. But yeah, until then, everyone.
I look forward to seeing your stand-up routine.
We'll see. It takes a lot of courage to get up there. Yeah. Hopefully something will come of it. We'll see. Yeah. But appreciate the vote of confidence there. So, all right, everyone, we're going to stop there and say, I hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossahouse can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossahouse offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossahouse, language resources for the global community.